Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the recording of this roundtable today. Today's topic was underachievement. We're actually going to come back to this again in December. And looking forward, I'd like to entertain the notion that we get very specific about policy recommendations, because the conversation today was so dynamic. We covered a lot of ground, from the data, definitions, what is underachievement, to what can educators do at school, how can they get really curious and get flexible, what can parents do at home, how can we bring in some of the strategies that professional coaches use to engage with people and help them tap into what they know about themselves, to really help them figure out what will work for them, figure out what they're no longer willing to tolerate about the current educational situation that they find themselves in. And then from there, let's go into, okay, what can I do? What can we do together? So today's roundtable is a really robust conversation. I am really thankful that people keep showing up and are able to really talk openly and create community around the challenge of serving the 1 in 10,000 kid. I think we're talking about gifted kids in this roundtable each time we meet, but I think you'll come to learn as we grapple with the real challenges that parents are facing. Probably the people who are showing up and engaging with us have a highly or profoundly gifted child. It could be. I'm not saying everybody, but it could be. So if you are one of those parents who are really struggling, and you're finding that the educators and those who understand gifted kids just seem to still not quite get your child, you're probably in the right place. So stick with us. Clearly, I'm not working out of a studio. I'm working out of my home. I'm doing this for really for 4 reasons. Let me see if I can remember them all. One is to help you network and create a sense of community among professionals and parents. Also helping you get a sense of the literature. We're sharing, and you'll see in the chat here, a bunch of references that were dropped. So what does the literature say? Advocacy, both in your school and at the state level and the national level, and then real strategies to use in your home. I think that was 4 things. So hopefully you'll be able to find that whatever you were looking for here in this roundtable, you're going to walk away with something of value. If there's still a burning question that you have or something you would like to see addressed next month, we're coming back to this next month because we have Brienne Hudak, who is going to be with us today, but something came up really urgently and she wasn't able to. So I'm really thankful my new friend Jessica was here, and Brian Lack, who spoke last month in October. Go back and watch that one because Brian was here today too to talk about how to be curious and flexible and how to reach kids for whom the little burn, the little fire inside for math seems to be dimming the longer they're in school. So I hope you enjoy this, and thank you for bearing with me as I'm getting, hopefully, slowly better at putting these together and moderating a vigorous conversation with a lot of really wonderful people. Really thanks to Michelle Barmazal from Mass Gifted for showing up today. Shout out to you, Michelle. You just got done with your conference yesterday, so thank you for taking the time to show up and continue investing your energy in this area. You would have really earned a day off today, Michelle, but you were there with us, so thank you so much. And thanks to the parents who joined us today. Reach out, drop a note below, let me know what else you'd like to hear, and look forward to next month. I think it'll be December 9th, but stay tuned. Go sign up on my website, coachallie.com, if you want to join us. They're free. So Coach Allie, ALLI.com. Thanks.
Hi, Allie.
Hello, hello. So everybody, we are recording, and this is our November 4th roundtable. And the topic today is underachievement. I can't wait to get started. It's a big topic. And I just want to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves, because I'm really happy to see some people I've been doing this with for some time now here with us, and also some new folks. So if it's okay, I'm not sure how we show up on screen, but I'm just going to start with having Michelle introduce yourself, and then Jessica, then Brian, okay, and then Dana and Kim. And then Dr. Matthews, if you can remember that. All right. So go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, so I'm Michelle Barmazal. I'm the co-president of the Massachusetts Association for Gifted Education. And I have been doing this for about 10 years.
And you had your big conference yesterday.
We had our big conference yesterday. Yeah, it was actually at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Great success. We had amazing speakers from all over. We had Del Sigley. We had just really fabulous speakers, and it went really well. So just in a little bit of recovery mode.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending today with us. And you always have great insights and questions. So I'm looking forward to kicking this off. Then I think I was shooting to Jessica next. Is that right?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Zimmerman. I am a gifted coach and instructional coach within the Roosevelt School District in Phoenix, Arizona. And I also sit on the board for Arizona Association for Gifted and Talented as a board of directors here in AZ.
And we just met recently, so I'm so happy to connect with you, and definitely shared passion here. And she's also collecting data that I have been really curious about. So if that happens to pop up today, please jump in and share what you are finding out, because I think it's really helpful to set the stage. All right, I think next to Dr. Lack, and then Dana and Kim.
Hey, my name is Brian Lack, and I am the district math specialist for Forsyth County Schools for grades K through 8. And I was a guest last month, and we talked a little bit about Beast Academy, and I'm very passionate about all things gifted math.
All things gifted math, and also making high quality, challenging math accessible to everybody, which really excites me because, you know, I'm sure this will come up. Sometimes we don't actually identify the gifted kids. We have some high capacity kids, and we're not picking them up with our routine identification. So for making high quality math available to everybody, we're potentially reaching them too. So thank you for your efforts there. All right, Dana, sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm glad you're here.
Sure. My name's Dana. I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I'm a parent of a gifted child who is severely underachieving compared to what he's capable of. So I'm here to learn and listen, and I know Allie from some professional research work.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, just for our educators here in the room, I think middle school age we're talking about, right?
He's 14. He's in 10th grade. He skipped kindergarten. So he's the age of a 9th grader.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. All right. And Kim is camera shy today. She's also, I think the real reason she's not on camera is she's at the Outer Banks and she doesn't want us to be jealous. So Kim, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Allie. I'm a Virginia Beach elementary school parent active in education reform topics. I started with gifted education, and I'm a huge proponent and product of school choice. I am a Massachusetts native. So hi, Michelle. Acton Boxborough High School, Boston University. And my child was formerly an underachieving gifted student prior to changing schools. So I look forward to your expertise.
Great. All right, Dr. Matthews, thank you again so much for joining us today. I know that you are an extremely busy person. You're now running your department, I think at the moment still, and you have a lot going on. Would you mind introducing yourself, and then we'll kick it off?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Matthews, and yeah, I'm a professor of gifted education and also now interim department chair of special education and child development at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And I've been working in gifted education for upwards of 20 years now, and have done some work over the years on underachievement and on high ability students dropping out of high school. And so I'm interested in these topics, and thank you, Allie, for putting all this together, because it's great to get to talk about these things with other people and learn new things from each other and share our perspectives.
Yeah, it really is. I appreciate you being here so much. So the goals for these roundtables are really to provide us a chance to talk about the research and expand our professional networks across state lines. And I'm really grateful for that. I ran into Dr. Matthews when we were trying to provide our oldest son some creative options. And also for me as a parent, it was very reassuring to not feel like such a failure, because our experience was by no means unique. And yet I was having trouble figuring out who I could talk to. So expanding professional networks, understanding the literature, increasing our ability to advocate, not only at our local level within classrooms, but at the state and the national levels on this topic. I've done my fair share there. And I know it's a very, very slow needle to move. And also giving parents real tools, insights from educators about what has worked in the classroom, And then maybe we can customize that to, how can that work in the home? And how can we really partner with educators to try to figure out what's actually going on? And I will just start with just kind of setting the table. I am now a professional coach in addition to being an epidemiologist because of the challenges around reaching gifted students. I now work with gifted adults, but my real passion is supporting parents in reaching their own kids, because I don't want to see coaches replacing the parent role. Honestly, that's my bias. Sorry, we've got one more person joining us. Should be popping in now. Hi, Ethan. Hey, Ethan, feel free to come off camera. And we were actually just getting going. When we have a convenient stopping point, I'll ask you to introduce yourself too when you're settled in and ready. So I was just saying, I'm now a professional coach because I want to help parents connect with their kids and figure out how to re-engage the student. Because very often these gifted students are quite good at learning and self-teaching. So when the systems break down, it's not necessarily something that is wrong with the student in any way. So looking for these indicators of underachievement, I really think is only half the story. It's really the tip of the iceberg. We would call these, sentinel events in public health. And yes, we should let Ethan know we're being recorded. Thank you, Michelle, for tracking that. Ethan, we are being recorded. I do post these roundtables for other people to view later. So defining underachievement, I think, is where we should start, figuring out what that means. Also talking about how prevalent it is by different grade levels and how it shows up. What are we looking for? And how we can address it in the classroom. So I think, Jessica, you weren't on tap to speak today necessarily, but I'd like to invite you to, because the guest who was planning to join Dr. Matthews today actually had something come up quite urgently, and she wasn't able to join us today, but she will be able to in December. So by all means, as comfortable as you feel, Dr. Lack and Jessica, please jump in. This is going to be, to the extent that I can create it, a very engaging roundtable where all of your perspectives, I hope you'll jump into. So here we go. Dr. Matthews, if you would like to start off with the data and the definition, and then Brian and Jessica, if you have anything to add to data and definition to get us going, that would be a really good place to start, I think.
Sure, I can jump in for a minute. So I'd say there's kind of two parts to it. There's kind of the popular definition, and then there's kind of the researchy definition. And so like the researchy one typically involves measuring ability and measuring achievement and looking for a discrepancy of some amount between those two areas. And so different numbers get thrown around in the literature. Sometimes it's one, sometimes maybe 1.5 or 2 standard deviations below on an achievement measure compared to the ability measure. And so there's this indication the student's capable of doing much more than they're actually doing. And I'd say then in the more everyday meaning, it's whenever we see somebody who we know is able to do better, which may not be a formal number, but we know from our experience with that person, or that especially that student, that they can do more than they're doing. And then we wonder how come they're not. And then that's underachievement.
Right. And so for in your classroom, this shows up as potentially, and you've shared this story many times, but it shows up potentially as somebody who is able to ace the tests, but they're reading very often or looking out the window. But when you drop a question, they're able to quite ably answer it. What else would any of the educators here like to offer as far as their perspective on that?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Go ahead, it's fine.
I was just going to say, a lot of the times it's when you see them in the classroom, I have the kids that they're seemingly off task. And usually if teachers leave it there and they don't check in with them, those are the ones that they say they weren't paying attention, or they weren't engaged, or they weren't whatever. And then more than half the time, if I ask them to adjust how they're assessing mastery for the student, whether it's they didn't get to the exit ticket or they didn't know, and they ask them, I had an example of a little kindergartner. He was doing laps in a classroom, and he was, the teacher was trying to give an assessment, and he would listen to the question. He would walk around the room And she would say, I need you to sit down to do your assessment. And he would walk around the room. And so by the end of the assessment, she goes, well, you have a 0 on your assessment. And I said, could you try asking him the items aloud? And she did. And he nailed every single one. And he was just like, and then when she said, why aren't you sitting down and paying attention? And he goes, my brain already went to this school, so I already know all the answers. And so it was kind of one of those clear, like, it doesn't mean that he can't, it just means that he isn't. And so it can show up, I think, in different ways. That was a playful example, because a lot of the times we see it in like that apathy in the older grades, the shutdown, the refusal, the head down, the I'm not doing this, I don't see the importance. Mm-hmm. Then we get into like the underachievement types, because there's, you know, those types of underachievement. But sometimes they don't see it as early on, that playful underachievement too. And that untreated can lead to that apathy later.
Now, what came up for you, Michelle? And then Brian, jump in if you have some observations.
We just had so many discussions on this yesterday. It's a big problem in Massachusetts. I don't know if most of you know, but we have no gifted education in Massachusetts. We are one of 3 states that have no laws, no funding, no mandate, no programming, no identification. So the fact that we got the Commissioner of Education to come give a keynote yesterday and tell us that they just hired somebody in the state since 30 years to oversee gifted and talented is going to be huge. And she seems amazing. They actually came from Oklahoma, where she was doing similar stuff there. We have a big problem in the state because we have so many kids just checking out and dropping out. We have a huge dropout rate that has not recovered really so well since the pandemic. And I think for a lot of the kids that are in that dropout category, a lot of them are gifted kids who just don't see the point of going back to school, because it's just too boring. It's not challenging. What's the point? They can learn much better at home. I don't know, if you guys found this, but for our kids in Massachusetts, the pandemic was actually a godsend for a big chunk of the gifted kids, because they could go at their own pace all of a sudden. They could do what they wanted to do and go much faster, and then just didn't see the point of going back. So we've had a huge upsurgence in homeschooling. Mm-hmm. But the ones in the classroom, they're just, we get these families that are in crisis all the time because their kids just are checking out. They don't see the point. They're not being challenged. It's not exciting. It's insulting their intelligence. We have a huge percentage of our gifted population with the label ODD slapped on their foreheads, which is oppositional defiant disorder, which, as somebody said to me, Michelle, how would you feel if you went to work every day and your boss said, here, please do this work? And it was, what's 1 + 1? And the next day you got, what's 2 + 2? You too would check out, get a little insulted by the person who was treating you with such disrespect, maybe start treating them with disrespect, AKA talking back. If you're a kid, you don't have the agency to say, hey, this isn't, this is insulting to me. And then you get misbehaving kids who just don't see the point and aren't doing it.
Yeah, very, really good observations. Do you have any data at all on the dropouts and what proportion are identified gifted by any chance?
I know there is data on what proportion are gifted. That is actually interesting. We might be able to do that just because based on MCAS data and of the MCAS, the higher tiers on the MCAS who are dropping out. However, as we all know, gifted kids aren't always the ones doing the best on the test too. So there's a group that's not being captured by that.
Right. Well, thank you. Keep us posted if you do uncover anything.
Sure.
Yeah, not to put anybody on the spot, but Brian, do you want to jump in with what you have seen in any of your classrooms related to these underachievers?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering about the intersection between students with ADHD and this phenomenon, and not at all to, imply blame on the student or even the school, but I'm curious if there's any data on that, because from anecdotal observations, I have personally and professionally seen many cases where there's just a misfit between the profile of the student and how engaging the environment, educational environment is with students with ADHD. And so That's something I've been thinking about as you guys have been talking.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And that's what keeps coming up for me. I'm in ADHD training right now as well, as a coach. And what keeps coming up for me is, it's the environment really needs to be strongly considered. And also, Jessica, as you were showing, how we assess mastery, there have been many times with our own kids where we have actually said, hey, you need to pick the 10 hardest problems of this 40 question assessment. Pick those 10 hardest ones and let's go from there. Let's not do all 40. Dr. Matthews, I know that you and I have talked a lot about the dropout rates, and those are kind of difficult to measure, and like they really are once we start digging around in the denominator. Oh, yeah. And then once we start parsing it even further to figure out what proportion of the dropouts are gifted, I'm kind of wondering where you'd like to go with the data on dropouts. If you want to cover some of your own research there, that would be amazing. I know you've done it before, but just for those joining us. And then also underachievement, what you might know about the data there.
Yeah, so it's been a few years, but in the mid 2000s, the first decade, I looked at dropout data from North Carolina, and as near as I can figure, well, at the time people were saying 20% of dropouts were gifted, and that seemed really high to me because there's a whole lot more students in that dropout population than there are students in the gifted population, and 20% of those would be probably more than the identified gifted students that we had to begin with. So I didn't think those numbers were quite right, and I was able to look at data from North Carolina, and the numbers I came up with were more on the order of 3/4 to 1% as a proportion. So it's a smaller number than people used to say. Now, mostly they've moved away from saying that. The other one I always kind of laughed at hearing was when they say half of all students are underachievers. And, of course they are, because that's the way an average works. Half of the students have got to be below an average. That's what makes it an average. So some of those kind of things that get thrown around, I think for their effect maybe aren't strictly speaking quite as accurate as we'd like to be. However, when you talk to people anecdotally, just about everybody knows somebody who they say, oh yeah, so-and-so I knew was a gifted kid who dropped out of school for whatever reason. Sometimes it's drop out of college, but sometimes it's drop out of high school. But either way, there's a big cost in a lot of ways for some of those decisions. And if we can help anybody not have that happen to them, it leaves more options open, even if they decide ultimately that they don't want to do what they got their degree in. They haven't shut themselves off from a whole field of inquiry by having dropped out of school and not able to study it, at that level. So that's kind of one way that I look at it. And I have not, since my study, seen very much data on it. The other academic study from around that same time period, or it's a pair of studies that actually looked at a much broader definition of giftedness and said anybody who took at least 2 advanced courses in high school counted as gifted. And so that was a very, very broad definition. That was almost 40% of the student population was counted as gifted. And among those, the dropout rate was much, much higher than it was among a stricter, much more narrowly defined subset of students that we think actually were formally identified as gifted in the schools. But that just goes back to what you said, and I'll reiterate that. I think I counted in that article 4 different ways that schools counted and reported dropout rates. And there's also a lot of underreporting and dropouts too, where they lost track of a kid and they just sort of marked them down as they went to another school, even though they have no evidence the kid ever went to another school, and maybe they did and maybe they didn't. But they don't want to count them as a dropout, so they're going to say they transferred out, and that makes their dropout rate look better and makes the school leadership look better overall, because look, we lowered our dropout rate. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of question about some of that. I think I first became suspicious of some of that when I looked at the number of students in my own high school in Georgia where I went to and we had 400 or 450 kids in the freshman class. And I think 170 of us graduated 4 years later. And yet the school district was reporting that we had a 10% dropout rate. So something wasn't right there. And I never really did get a straight story back at that time, but I did realize that there's a lot of different ways that they count things and different things that are or aren't reported. And so it's a thorny issue to investigate. And now one of the other areas that I've studied has been homeschooling of gifted and high ability kids with my colleague Jennifer Jolly, who's a professor at the University of Alabama. And we've found, as have others, huge growth rates, especially since the pandemic and during the pandemic, in rates of students being homeschooled. And there's a huge proportion now of high ability kids being homeschooled. And some of them are, I think, for the same reasons that you guys have already mentioned. Just the schools don't always individualize well for student specific needs. And it may be boredom, it may be a twice exceptionality issue, it may be a pacing issue. There's lots of different ways that schools don't always meet the needs of those kids. And for the families and students who have the ability to say, okay, we're going to check out of that and do this on our own, if you have the resources and the time and the money that it takes to do that, then a lot of times you see that as a better choice for you and your family, and you say, okay, let's give it a shot. Most of the people we interviewed a number of years ago said that it wasn't that they had consciously decided to become homeschools. It was that they were sort of forced into it because they tried usually multiple different school settings, public, private, whatever, and none of them were working for their kid. And that's when they finally said, fine, we got to try homeschooling. And some of them did it for a year or two and went back to traditional schools. Some of them never looked back. They said, this is so much better than what our students had that we're going to just do this all the way through.
Oh,
Can I pop in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
You said so many important things, and you kind of like painted the big picture of where everybody ends up, and it's difficult because the school system set everything up that way inadvertently. So I'm part of the child study team. So as an instructional coach, I get a really nice cushy spot in between students going to special education, and I get to support that possible identification of underachievement in gifted students because I get to, with my knowledge, tell them a lot of the things that they're seeing that are screening them for, I think they're possible ADHD or possible they're slapping all the labels they can possibly think. When they're sitting down and saying, I have a student that has these issues, and whether that be they don't want to test with me because they say it doesn't matter, or they have anxiety with this test because they have this test anxiety. I think they have anxiety, so they need to be treated. Or they'll say, they just don't care. They don't like me. They shut down whenever I talk to them. All of these different characteristics that are very common with underachievement. I'm like, okay, so the psychologists even, they want to go further into the different pieces like ADHD or oppositional defiance. I have a lot of gifted kids that they're coming through for a behavior 504 that happens 4 to 5 times a year. And I've been at this school for close to 10 years now. It's like a good 7 out of 10 times the kid, I say, let me assess him. I give him the COGAT first. If he can't focus, because he might be dual diagnosis, might be a little ADHD as well. And then I can do the one-on-one paper-based. And if I don't find him on COGAT, I usually find him with a paper-based because it's a little easier with a one-on-one. And then I do find them and they go, oh, that's interesting. So those were characteristics of underachievement that we were seeing. And what's difficult is when the psychologist is sitting in the same exact conversation, they're not trained because they don't have tools that have those characteristics of giftedness. So they're going off of what they have access to, which does have some overlap in giftedness and some of the other diagnoses, but it's just if people had education and training early on at this level of the system, we would see monumentally less misdiagnosis of children, and they would be able to see that what they're seeing is not the student choosing to not work or whatever. It's underachievement, and then, hey, what do I do to reverse it? So there's definitely something we can do as a school system and early on, but it does start with educating your teachers on what the signs are, and especially your psychologists as well.
I'm glad you brought
Yeah.
that up, Jessica, because as a parent, I feel like, and have for many years, and only now actually am I beginning to realize that there probably is still a great deal of potential for us to do more professional development on what giftedness really looks like. Because I think there's been a tremendous reliance on standardized tests, and just listening to, I always blank when under pressure on the name of the person, but I was listening to a good podcast yesterday about the limitations of testing for giftedness, and that if you get a high 99th percentile, that's believable. But if you get a low percentile, that's not necessarily believable, because it's much easier for us to fail to find gifted kids than it is for somebody to somehow fake being 99th percentile. So
Exactly.
I've seen that in my own life. And I think that we're missing a lot of kids. And one of our school board members, who's a liaison to our Gifted Citizens Advisory Committee that I chair, she has also brought up, hey, you know, I sit on the referrals, you know, I, like you were talking about, Jessica, in our email thread, I sit and see these kids who come in for behavioral referrals, and they're really bright. And so I've had this gut that we're actually missing kids because they're showing up in these behavioral issues because the environment is not challenging enough. More often than not, I'm just going to hazard a guess, they're male. And these sorts of, you know, choosing not to do things is something that I'm really familiar with in our family. Like, there's a lot of stubbornness that runs through our family, and choosing not to do something or just forgetting to turn in something that had no value was a sign for me that the educational environment was wrong. It's not the person who is over here teaching himself all kinds of things that he's passionate about. Michelle, I know this probably resonates for you too, but absolutely zero issues learning. In fact, an incredible drive to learn if we as parents are able to look outside the school setting. And so this is an opportunity for Kim or Dana, if you want to jump in and talk about the parent perspective. What are you seeing at home that is different than what the teacher is maybe seeing at school? And what can we learn from that disparity? You know, what do we actually really know about our kids, and how can we trust ourselves as parents to know and connect with that human being and use that information in a way to help reconnect with a love of learning, even if school feels very confining and in fact, in many times, I hate to say this, but harmful to the child. So I know both my parents are now off camera, and it may not be the right time, but I just wanted to, you know, throw it back to any of you who want to jump in on this.
I'm not sure how candid I'm allowed to be. I might need Dana to go first.
Go ahead, Kim.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we pulled our 7-year-old gifted identified student out of our zone school. And quite frankly, I found that a lot of administrators were kind of in denial about some of the challenges. She just wasn't their problem. She spent a lot of time last year in the school nurse's office, just kind of hanging out. She was in a low-ranked school with children who couldn't read, and it was under the guise of differentiated instruction. So they stuck her on the Chromebook, and I gave a school board speech about that. Virginia Beach also has a controversial gifted standalone school. It's currently grades 2 through 8, which in my opinion exacerbates some of these problems. It's highly unusual. There's only one other school like this in the whole state of Virginia. And Dr. Plucker and other experts have told our administration it's better to have several or no gifted schools. So thankfully now we pay tuition for a better school, but I still like to stay tuned into some of these topics.
Yeah, thank you for that. Hey, Dana. I just wanted to, now that you're back on camera, I really wanted to get the parent perspective in this too, because one of the goals, as I mentioned, for this roundtable is really to empower parents to trust themselves and reconnect with the student and really figure out what can be done, how to maximize the good of school and reduce the harm. So I'm just curious what thoughts or questions are coming up for you.
Well, I hear a lot of the things that everyone is mentioning, and I hear like stories of my son in all of those, like what Jessica said about the little boy who said that his brain already went to this school, so he didn't have to do it anymore. Something very similar happened to our son when he was in 5th grade. For all of the math tests, you were supposed to do a personal reflection after the math test. So he aced the tests, and it said, did you study? No. How did you feel you understood the material? I understood it perfectly. What would you do differently next time? Nothing. And like stuff like that, resonates. I think our biggest challenge, and you have all alluded to this, is that there really is there's no regulation or requirement for a school to make sure that a child achieves what they are capable of achieving. And therefore, anytime I call the school or talk to a teacher, or, last year I was trying to beg administration to give our son academic detention for failing to turn in his homework. And they said, no, nobody will do anything for you unless they're actually failing. And it's a struggle as a parent, because you just want them to do the things to get the grades so that they can do what they eventually want to do. But because you don't have any leverage once you get to a certain age that they are, and they just, they put their head down. They don't want to do it. It's useless to them. And, we're in a spot where we really don't know how to argue against his logic. He's got like a 75 in math, but if you just took out his tests, he has a 98. He's like, why the way that the class is structured, and the way it seems as though all education is structured we have 4 kids, is that as long as you hand in some semblance of an effort on your homework or essay, you're going to pass or get a decent grade on the class. Whereas he doesn't want to do all those little things. He just wants to know the material and, take the test.
What does he really love?
He used to really love math. I think he finds anything that he's interested in, and he really likes diving deep in knowledge, like his knowledge of history and geography and politics of like other countries, like is unbelievable. Like there's things that he's said that my husband doesn't even know, and he went to school and he has a history degree. So, but it's not reflective in his grades at all.
Yeah, it's understandable. Michael, I know that you've seen students like this in your classrooms. What did you do to reconnect with those students? And Brian, I'm sure you have too, and Jessica, so I'd like to hear all 3 of you.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing what other people do, because that was at the early stages of my teaching career, and I don't think I was really doing anything effective. Unfortunately for them, I think they moved along. They passed the class with a B or a C, and they went on and did something else. I don't know what, because I lost track of them. That was 25 plus years ago now, so they're probably successful adults now, would be my guess.
But what you did do, and that touched my heart, is you were curious. You knew something was up. And I think that's all it takes. Honestly, it's all it takes from my research on underachievement is one educator who is like, I see you, and I care about you. And I see this disparity between what you're saying and what you're thinking and the questions you're asking, and when you're engaged in the topic, and then what's coming in, through the web portal where they submit homework. So you were curious, I know, and you tried to engage, and also went to the other teachers. We're like, there's something going on here. How can we reach this person?
I mean, it was really these students were the ones that got me interested in gifted education, and that changed the rest of my career ever since. So I'm afraid I got more out of the deal maybe than they did from me at the time.
That's really generous and humble of you. But what is your driving research passion right now? What are you doing with that energy that these students incited in you?
I mean, I'm still trying to understand what's going on. What is the question we don't have a good answer for yet. We have some ideas of what works for these students, but there's still not not a way to say, okay, let's find this and this and this information from this kid and then use that to figure out what they need. I think we have good ideas anecdotally, and some of them are very effective with some kids. And it may be that the phenomenon is just so broad and so many different causes that there isn't any one thing or even one small set of things. And maybe it's got to be completely individualized for every kid to get them what they need, to do what they want with their lives. And I think for some people, it's also, depending on what you want to do with your life, there's some things that you do that have nothing to do with formal schooling, and maybe you don't need the formal schooling. As a fan of public education, I hate to say that to anyone, but there are things outside of schools. If a kid wants to be a ballet dancer, public school is not the place that they're going to become a good ballet dancer, probably. It's not something schools teach. But for kids who are good in reading and good in mathematics and good in science and good in history and social studies, there are things you can do outside of the academic system, but there's an awful lot of training that happens within the academic system, because those are the areas that schools have been designed to address. They're not as good at not as good as we used to be, I feel like, in vocational areas. There's other pathways for some of that out there. There's apprenticeship programs and things. For some students, that's really what they want to do. They want to do something with their hands. They're perfectly smart and able to do the academic work. But if what they prefer is doing things with their hands, let them find something that combines those areas. Don't force them to not do anything with their hands so that they can focus only on the academic parts, because they're not going to be happy and they're not going to want to do the work. So, I guess that's not really a great answer. Let me hear what you guys think. Love to hear y'all's experiences and perspectives on this.
Well, I'd love to pick on Brian for a minute, just because we touched on a person, who loves math, and, this is your area, Brian. You love math, and what would you like to bring up here as, possible opportunities to re-engage a student, and what would you share with a parent from your own experience?
I think what you said about curiosity, showing that authentic curiosity is the most important way to approach this. I'm also thinking about, just flexibility. I think that's what these kids really need, is because the traditional rigid structures that we apply at least in the public school setting, that's one of the reasons why they underperform. And so, we have to look at those, put them under a microscope and say, hey, maybe some of these aren't good for you. And, one of the things I think about is personal contracts you can make with students. You can say, hey, let's set some goals. What are some things that you like to do, you want to do? What are some things you don't want to do, and why? Why do they add no value? If you can clearly articulate that, but then also hold yourself accountable for, being productive and engaging in the learning in some other kinds of ways. I'm totally fine with that. One example is mental math. I can't tell you how many middle school and elementary school teachers and high school teachers are so rigid about kids performing mental math in class. It's like a sin. And they will say, show your work, or else you will lose points, even if you're correct. And I think that is the dumbest, most harmful belief and practice that you can employ. So one of the things I did when I was in the classroom is I would say, I love myself. I love using mental math. But sometimes it does get me in trouble when I should be using a calculator, or I should be using pencil and paper or whatever. So I would just tell my students that, hey, as long as you are 80%, 90% accurate with your mental math, then I'll let you do it. But once I see that you're, constantly making a lot of procedural errors, putting you below that threshold, then I'm going to make you show your work to some extent. Right. So it's all about flexibility, I think.
I love that.
Brian said so many things. I was like, yes, yes, yes. So I think the biggest thing that, I'm kind of reflecting on is when my teachers come to me and they're talking about it being a kid thing. I push it back and I hold the mirror up and I say, how is it a good thing? Let's take a look at some internal behaviors and some things that would add to this underachievement. And so I don't know if you've heard of the trifocal model. And so that is essentially a piece for reversing underachievement. So it's some literature that you can find. Baum was someone that supported a lot of these intensive case studies where they tracked and observed and interviewed sets of gifted students across years and grade bands that were underachievers. And essentially they discovered these key behaviors from these students' teachers. And so the key behaviors were, they were provided with inappropriate curriculum, which I think we talked a little bit about, just the school not meeting the need, different emotional problems or social issues that were found within the classroom, also kind of exacerbated by the teachers. So maybe it was a lack of a relationship, or it was asking them to do trivial work, or it was attacking their dignity, or whatever other little things that could kind of bridge into that underachievement. And then potential learning problems. And what they found was, with specific interventions from the teacher, they were able to reverse the underachievement. And so, like our friend Michael said, was mentor relationship. So if you take on that mentor relationship, sometimes that is one of the biggest interventions you can do, which is and also similar to what Brian was talking about, setting some goals comes through some of that mentor relationship. And then the focusing on strengths, self-selected topics, that's where curiosity is at its as biggest and boldest. And so a part of these things, if my teachers would ever say, my kids are underachieving, just as I would sit down and say, okay, they're underachieving on fractions, what would we do? We'd teach a mini lesson on fractions. We would provide an intervention on fractions. Why aren't we doing that for any of these other things that we're seeing in the classroom? It's a mini lesson, it's an intervention. So if we see underachievement, they don't have a lesson plan for that. So yeah, you have to do some digging and planning, and it is per kid. But how are we going to sit down, work to support the student, have gifted kids need to know how it ties to real world. It needs to matter. It needs to make sense. They're not going to do more of the same. If you throw mots at them, you're going to lose them. So these are some of the essential pieces of supporting teachers with interventions. And I am going to say, as a coach, my job is to be there to understand that my teachers, it might just be a skill thing. They just might not know how to support their students with underachievement, because it's not happening in their undergrad programs. They're not being taught underachievement or gifted characteristics. And so they're just shooting in the dark oftentimes. And so when I can support them with reflecting, most of the times I go, oh, okay, I didn't realize it was a me thing. I thought it was a them thing, and they feel empowered. But yeah, that focus, really, if you've addressed those different pieces from that trifocal model, you can see an increase in their relationships with the adults, because a lot of the times once a gifted kid can feel connected to an adult, it's like, okay, I trust what you're going to give me is going to be worth my time. Or if you get off some of those things, like Brian said, requiring them to show their work. Where in school does it say we have to literally draw everything out? Then we can make some really big waves with what's happening in the classrooms. And then for parents, knowing some of these things too, so that you can advocate for some of these interventions to take place. And you can also be the source of that intervention. And so empowering parents to say, the teacher might not be that peer mentor, but can a previous teacher, because sometimes kids connect to their previous teacher and they go back and they get those little, adjustments of, what are your goals and what do you want? And the kid will come back rejuvenated, reinvigorated. I know we've all worked under bosses before that we just can't stand, but there's someone in the office that's our mentor. So I kind of tell the kids like that. There are some teachers you're not gonna love. You're not gonna dig them. I have bosses that I don't dig, but I'm gonna find someone that's gonna help me grow. Because what Brian said too, there is a part that I have to own, which is how I show up. I can't just let underachievement ruin me. I have to say, okay, this is how I'm showing up, and I have to do some things to make sure that I'm not letting it tank me as well.
Such,
I would like,
yeah.
I would like to pose an incredibly naive but intentional question, just for us to talk about all of these great points everybody's bringing up. Why don't we have the equivalent of individualized education plans for gifted students then?
Well, they do in Pennsylvania,
Some states do.
Yeah.
Some states do. Okay, I did not know that.
like 2 or 3. Like Pennsylvania is a big one. I'm blanking on the others.
It seems so logical.
I think Florida may have something similar, although they don't call it an IEP, they call it something else, but
Right.
it's similar.
Okay, so why do the majority
I think
not?
because there's no benefit, there's no carrot, there's no compensation for getting
Funding.
kids to the high end. There's compensation or achievement or recognition somehow when you have X amount of children passing and X amount of children graduating. It doesn't matter what their grades are.
In Massachusetts, it's only a matter of bringing kids up to a certain level, and once their box is ticked, and then they say you're done. I have a child who, when he was 10, was working at a high school level, and he was at a private school that couldn't meet his needs, and we pulled him out and took him to the district, and the district basically met us in the middle school, started pulling books off the shelves and said, he's way beyond any of this. You need to just wait till high school, and then you can put him in high school. He was 10. And I said, well, what are we going to do in the meantime? And they're like, we don't know. You're on your own. So they didn't provide any support. And
The leverage here that
Yeah.
did work on Bay Bridge Island 10 years ago is that's where we first started. So Washington State, they actually, the school district moved to a growth model where they wanted to see at least a year's worth of growth, academic growth for every student, which means meeting students really where they are, right? At least a year's worth of growth. So this was 10 years ago, and they were actually using NWEA's MAP. Whether or not we like standardized testing, it at least provided them a sense of, okay, where is the child now? And so, yeah, they're 10, but they're actually testing at a 235, which mapped over to algebra. So it was believable. So it gave us something, parents and teachers in the district, a way to say, okay, how are the students doing? Because prior to that, they actually allowed me to look at the data prior to a big push toward teachers being trained in differentiation and how to ask questions and how to open up access for everybody. The high students were not growing. So using that kind of district data, we could actually parse it by where they started baseline. Were they above grade level when they entered, or were they below? We could see that the schools generally and teachers, bless their hearts, do a great job bringing kids up to grade level. But if you started at grade level or higher, you were not growing. You had 0 or negative growth in the early years. And that really, once people had that data in front of them, they really realized the importance of differentiated instruction. They actually looked at a new math curriculum. They looked at, because the standard off-the-shelf curriculum only has like a +1, -1. Jessica, you would know more than me and Brian, but it really does not give you 3, 4 grade levels of differentiation off the shelf for a teacher. They absolutely have to go and find something else, which then gets back to Beast Academy as being, a potential way of providing something off the shelf to meet the students where they are. So it really is a challenge if there's no growth standard. If it's just passing, the MCAS or the SOLs, if it's just passing, we just actually had data given to us by our district to show, I've been asking for data on our gifted kids, and part of the data that was brought to me was just sheer numbers, how many are identified, and demographics, and then SOLs. Well, 98, 99% of the gifted kids are passing the SOLs. It doesn't tell me anything about what's happening to them academically during the school year. So I'm trying to increase the awareness around, we need data on gifted students, or we have no idea why they're so disenchanted with school, why engagement with school goes off a cliff, especially by high school.
Allison, to that point, we went to our State Department as our organization. And one of the things that I hate as an instruction coach every year is I have to enter the data on how my students with identified special needs have grown. I have to enter how my English language learners have grown. And I get angry every year. There's no box for gifted. Every year, I'm like, why aren't we monitoring the other groups? And so we went to the State Department and I said, we need a monitoring form. And the person over school improvement said, oh, that's a click of a button. I said, well, can you click the button? Because I think if schools were held accountable to the growth of all of their groups, it would matter. And also a big part to that is we were talking about funding earlier. In the state of Arizona, I don't know how it is for you. We have something called a Group B weight. So our gifted students get about $70 per identified gifted student, versus $158 for our English language learners and $2,300 for students with identified special needs. And so for a district, they're looking at, where do the resources go? Well, where the money is, that's where we'll put the time, that's where we'll put the energy. And so it's hard because you have all these separate schools trying to do the best thing. But if we can get it in the State Department, which is kind of back to Brian's point, why is this not a national thing, right?
Mhm.
Why doesn't everyone have an ALP, a DLP, or whatever other acronym we want to call it? But in all of us the states, we're trying the best that we can. Really, it needs to be, if this is going to be a big thing, we need to advocate at the national level.
I agree. I hear you. I'm looking at the
Yeah.
time. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to give everybody a chance to just do a really quick wrap up. Michelle, if I could.
Have you guys seen that diagram of the average fifth grade classroom? That there's an average of, in average fifth grade classroom, there are 7 levels of ability.
Mhm.
And there's this beautiful diagram that came out a few years ago about this. I have it up on my screen, but I don't know how to share with you.
Yeah, and Dr. Matthews was actually co-author with Dr. Plucker in 2015, I believe, on Invisible Students, illustrating it. Maybe a similar graph that you're looking at, Michelle, but 2%.
Yeah, we talked about that in some of our work. Yeah. I would add to just a few years ago, I think North Carolina finally decided to require monitoring of gifted students as one of our subgroups. And that does seem to be making a good difference. When the districts have to count that, they start paying attention to it. Whereas before that, or in other states, several other states I've worked in, when you ask the people, they're like, oh, we don't have the resources to find out that information. There's no one who would do that. And so they just, by not collecting it, they just can pretend it doesn't exist or isn't a problem. And so I would say, as an advocacy target, national things would be great, but at the state level, oftentimes it's easier to make things happen at the state level because people tend to be better connected, and it's maybe more shared ideas. And so, I think for our state gifted organizations, that kind of thing ought to be a priority. If it's not happening in every state, it should be brought to the table. And there are a few model policies out there, like I think North Carolina's, although I'd have to look up the details. But there are a few places doing that we can say, yes, this is a good idea, and we should do it in more places.
Yeah, let's look that up, Dr. Matthews. I can help try to find that too, but North Carolina is doing some interesting things as far as data and accountability too, as far as I'm aware, and related to growth. So that would be great to bring back. I would love to just take my minute and follow up on what Jessica was saying regarding studies. You mentioned one Baum, I think, BAUM maybe.
I can drop it in the link too.
Yeah, do that. There was one that I looked at a while ago. This is just to give hope to any parents who are listening about what they can do at home. There's one that I tried to summarize as well as I could in a previous roundtable, and it's Emmerich, I believe. Let me just pull it up here. Emmerich, and it's from 1992. But it was, so there's not a ton of research here, folks. So I had to go pretty far back. But it was a multi-state study looking at middle schoolers, and 8 out of 10 of them were male. They had a middle school slump, which now that I have some experience and distance on this, I know is very common, and then high school reversal. And so the big question is, what happened? What helped to reverse this slump during middle school? And all of these students had very active outside interests. So they were really passionate. They had a love of learning, and they really saw their outside interests as being an escape from school. It also gave them a sense of self-worth in the face of failure at school. So those outside interests are really protective, and the astute educator will figure out what those outside interests are and connect them back in some way to school. The students also felt like grades and achievement were not meaningful or important. And I've seen this in our house too, like really didn't matter. And so when push comes to shove, this is not a leverage point. I kept trying to find which lever to push to figure out how we get, paperwork handed in, and it just never mattered enough. And so all of my attempts at, let's be honest, it was coercion, really were not effective. And it was really eroding my relationship with my son. So I backed away from that and tried to figure out what are the outside interests, where are we seeing the strengths, what are the passions really? Let's really play on that. And then let's go and cherry pick the very best teachers who have good relationships with unusual, interesting students and put my son in front of those teachers so that school becomes a place where there is engagement with an adult who cares, and do a hybrid program. So working with a principal to see if we can do an A day, B day alternate, where A day is on campus, B day is doing, passion projects and other curriculum that's not available through the public school. And allowing the student to see that advanced experiences in class are fun and they actually can apply them to outside interests. So that gets to Brian's comment on flexibility. Allowing the student and the teacher work out something that might allow them to play to their strengths. So I see Brian's posting something in the chat too. So before we all hang up, make sure you grab things from the chat. Teachers really do have a positive impact. So any teachers who are watching this recording, please know that you really do make a difference. And I have personally reached out to teachers on behalf of my son to try to find those that will have an engagement with him as a human being. Don't see the student as a problem to be solved or fixed, and really make sure that you try as best you can. If you have one of these interesting students in your classroom, get curious, like our educators here with us today did, like Michael did all those years ago with that student. I think it was a science classroom, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, chemistry.
Chemistry? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And for the parents listening, I know, Jessica, you're a coach. I'm now trained as a coach. It's a work in progress, adopting that mindset with my own family, because I'm like, goodness gracious, can we not just get this done? So I'm trying to pull back from that.
And we do teacher trainings.
Type of mindset and look for those open-ended questions that allow us to get at what's actually really going on here. What do you really care about here? And I think Brian might have mentioned this, or maybe you did, Jessica. What do you want to see more of? What do you want less of? What can you not tolerate any longer? Let's figure out what that is and demonstrate that we're willing to meet you halfway. We're the adults here. We think we know what's best, but especially for middle school and getting older, they are starting to have their own views about what matters to them. And so trying to see ourselves as peers versus project managers was a big turning point for me. Any other closing thoughts, folks?
We're doing teacher training in Massachusetts, actually across the whole country when we're doing it online, and just trying to bring awareness to teachers about this population and about all these things that would make their lives so much easier in the classroom if they had the tools.
And it sounds like, Jessica, you've been doing a lot of that work too. And I took some notes on advocacy at the state level. Parents also talking to the school about differentiated instruction, right, Jessica? And Brian, I mean, this should be a conversation that parents can have, especially if the student is identified gifted. They should be able to ask, how are you differentiating instruction? Where does acceleration fit into that? You can look up your state laws related to the regulations around teaching gifted kids, and you can pull up exactly what your district is supposed to be doing, and acceleration is in there. And that may mean several grade acceleration for the subject.
There's this huge trend right now, Allie, to go against that. And I know California just passed this thing, and they're trying to do it here too. You can't go beyond algebra until 8th grade. Like everybody has to do algebra in 8th grade. So when you've got the kids like mine who's doing calculus BC in 9th grade, you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, California tried that, and there was a massive uprising around that. But so your states do have regulations related to the education of gifted students. So go and actually pull the language from your state regs, and don't hesitate to bring that in with you, just to talk about how is this actually being done, because it is very difficult to hold schools accountable, and teachers may not even know what are my options for accelerating this child. The poor teacher may not have any experience with profoundly gifted kids or highly gifted kids. They may see gifted kids as being the advanced kids who are one grade level ahead. They may not have any idea what to do with the other unusual and interesting people that we've been talking about. I'll get off my soapbox. I just want to go around and give everybody last minute, and thank you so much for your time being here.
Oh, Jessica, you're muted.
Had to do at least once, guys, right? Okay. So it's awesome to get everybody in the room. It's always nice because we're oftentimes, I find, the only voice in the room saying this. And so when you get with other people that you don't have to convince that our gifted kids matter. It's really empowering and igniting. So thank you for this opportunity.
So true. Thank you. Brian, any last thoughts?
It was a great discussion. I learned so much, and I hope there's a way that we can all stay in touch. I'm assuming many of you probably go to NAGC annually.
I'll be there.
I'll be there.
All right.
I will be there.
And we'll keep bringing your penetrating questions, Brian. There's no crazy question here, okay? Michelle, any last thoughts? And then Michael and Dana, and then we'll wrap up.
I have so many, Allie, so many. I mean, I just spent an entire 12 hours yesterday doing this and just having these very discussions. So it's just really important that we make sure, I think the only way to really get around this is to start educating our teachers and letting them know what to do with these kids in the classroom, because they're there and they're not being served currently. And it would be a much better world if they were.
Well put.
I would echo that. One of the areas I'm working on a project right now is looking at what evidence we have in the teacher training literature about training teachers to work with gifted students. And it's a lot thinner than you would think it is when you start digging down into it. But I think, from an advocacy point of view, I think getting the local policies and state policies in place is just a key thing that we all ought to be trying to work on. Acceleration policies, if you have one, you can point the principal at it, because it's usually the principal's decision whether a kid gets grade skipped or otherwise accelerated. For example, if the principal doesn't like it and there's no policy saying that they're supposed to like it, if a kid meets certain criteria, they're probably going to say no. And at that point, you don't really have much of a choice as a parent about what to do about it. Same thing with these other things, on the other hand, a couple other things that North Carolina's got. One is this credit by demonstrated mastery policy, which is only a few years old, which lets kids get some high school credits while they're taking things in middle school. And that's been a good thing. It's more like single subject acceleration, but it's still a good thing. And then the other one is they've added recently an automatic placement where it says that if kids are scoring at the top level on the state test in math in elementary school, that they have to be placed into whatever the most advanced math class on their grade level is after they've shown that mastery on the state testing. And that's essentially working like universal screening and helping a lot of students who otherwise maybe their parents didn't advocate it for it or the teachers didn't notice it, but the kids clearly have the math competency to be able to be pushed farther and learn more. And it's saying those kids have to be placed into those classes. And that's been, I think, a good thing overall as well. So those are the kinds of policy things that I think we can start pushing districts and states into having some discussions and thoughts around these things. And that's a positive direction and step that we can all take.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to re-listen to this recording to pick up all of this goodness here. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And in the chat, there's quite a few resources. So thank you all so much for staying over a little bit. We do have one more of these coming up in December. Brianne will be able to come back. We're looking at possibly the second Monday of December, because the first one will be right after the Thanksgiving holiday. I think people might be a little turkeyed out by then. So look for the second Monday in December, and hopefully we'll see you back. And I really, again, appreciate your time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye, everybody.